You're by now all certainly aware, or it won't surprise you to know, that Muslims in the United States are feeling rather unsettled right now. And this is not just because of some sudden appearance of Islamophobia out of nowhere. That's been present to varying degrees and in varying forms, I think, since the immediate aftermath of 9/11. But I think particularly because Trump has brought into the White House, as very senior advisors to him, a cast of characters that hold a set of views with respect to Islam that until recently could fairly be described as extremely fringe views. These are people, and we've heard some of the names already: Steve Bannon, Sebastian Gorka, Stephen Miller, those three in particular, but also the former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn, now officially out of the picture, but I think not entirely out of the picture in terms of the worldview that he represents. These people are not the representative of a type of view that is more common in the United States, where people who don't know much about the world or is not as engaged with Middle East affairs or things like that kind of think of Islam and have concerns about terrorism. For Bannon, for Gorka, for Flynn, for Miller, Islam represents, in their view, an existential threat to the American way of life. For them, there's some fundamental contradiction between Islam and American values, as they understand it, which means that American Muslims right now, I think quite understandably under Trump, are wondering whether there is a place for them in their own country. And it certainly leads us to wonder how this is going to play out. What might we see next? You all already know about the travel ban. You've probably heard talk about efforts in the United States to ban the Muslim Brotherhood, to designate it as a terrorist organization, which means that we may see ourselves quite soon doing a version of the Muslim Brotherhood review that was done here. And this, of course, all happening on the back of Trump's campaign promises to ban Muslims from entering the United States, or to create a Muslim registry. And so all of this kind of gets one to think about, well, what sorts of strategies might one employ? How do we engage with, how do we react to this? I mean, on the one level, one thing that is happening and that I take to be a very positive sign is that there's certainly something of a rebirth of grassroots, civically engaged politics in the United States. I think many Americans, even by standard measures like voter turnout and things, had become somewhat disengaged from politics. A lot of sort of political apathy, just from the sort of vantage point that I generally speak from, that as a university professor. When I first moved to the United States from the UK in 2000, on my university campus, there were protests and demonstrations around political issues fairly regularly. That was something they did. Students did that kind of stuff. In more recent years, just doesn't seem to happen because everyone thinks they're doing it by tweeting the right thing, right? You're engaged and you're raging, in 140 characters. But that only gets you so far, I would argue. So when one thinks about strategies, there are a couple of broad kinds of ideas that I've been playing with in my mind that I wanted to share with you this afternoon. One of them is maybe a little bit provocative, just because I think it will maybe be misunderstood, what I'm trying to say. And the other is just almost a sort of metaphor or trope that I'm playing with, but I think potentially has power as something to build on, a platform going forward. So the first one of these, and I'm not entirely sure what language to use here, but I guess it's something like this. Should, or when should, Muslims start refusing to be Muslims? When should Muslims stop allowing their Muslimness to be the defining feature that governments and their fellow citizens and others use to engage, approach, and define them? Because one of the most worrying things that I think I've seen, certainly with respect to how the American public and the American government thinks about and conceptualizes Islam and Muslims, is the creation of Muslims as an object of governance in the aftermath of 9/11 in the United States. And let me kind of try and specify what I mean by that. And I think you'll kind of immediately get shades of this. So when I was first doing research on Muslim communities in the UK, we weren't at a point where their Muslimness was the only thing that was being talked about, the only labels that were being used. People at that point were still often spoken of in relation to their ethno-national heritage, right? Let's get into the derogatory language, the language that the haters were using, right? In the 80s, people were Pakis. In France, they were les sales arabes, right? These are ethno-national reference points. In the United States, when these people were noticed at all, because they weren't in the way that they were in the UK, these communities in the United States generally were much better integrated into society. They were sort of firmly middle class, kind of not much to see here kind of thing until after 9/11. But when they were visible in the public realm, they were Arab Americans or South Asian Americans, again, those ethnic reference points. What I'm describing then is a phenomenon whereby after 9/11, on both sides of the Atlantic, all of these people come to be redescribed and reinscribed in the public imagination, in the public policy discourse, as Muslims first and foremost, as if their religious identity and their faith is the most relevant and important thing for you to know about them, to supposedly understand who they are and how they think and how they see the world. And to me, this was just very, very dangerous. It was reductionist, and it involved projecting and ascribing to people an identity that, yes, at some level they probably would embrace or hold, but could not possibly be the sum totality of who they are. Certainly I first noticed this under the Bush administration, but the Bush administration in the United States after 9/11 was not uniquely guilty of it. It's something the Obama administration that I served in myself did. They did it in a different way. They did it in a way that tried to put a kind of positive spin on Muslimness, right? So Obama gives the famous Cairo speech in 2009. A few months before that, he gives a talk in Ankara before the Turkish parliament where he declares that from here forward, U.S. relations with Muslim communities around the world will cease to be about security and terrorism and will instead be about shared interests and partnerships. And so you have the U.S. government then over the next few months creating a whole set of programs, the appropriation of $100 million for Muslim engagement activities, the appointment at the State Department of a special representative to Muslim communities. And that brought me to a screeching halt. The State Department has an ambassador to the Ummah. That's just weird to my mind. That's just bizarre. It was the first time in the history of U.S. foreign policy that we had appointed someone to sort of be our envoy to an entire world religion. And it's confusing, right? Because there are 1.6 billion Muslims in the world, and they are Senegalese, Jordanians, Indonesians, Sudanese, Kazakhs, you name it, right? They're all over the place. And usually in U.S. foreign policy, we regard and engage non-U.S. nationals by reference to the citizenship of the nation state of which they are citizens. That's how our foreign policy works. We have policies towards countries. And here we were creating this idea that there's this global Muslimness thing out there that we were going to engage. We were going to engage it because we wanted to mend fences. We wanted to improve relations after the disastrous wars of George W. Bush. We're going to make nice with the Muslims again. So between 2009 and 2010, Muslim engagement becomes the flavor of the month in Washington, D.C. It was the cool, hip thing that all the Hollywood stars were doing. It's like, oh my God, I have so many Muslim friends. They're so awesome. I love Muslims. A little bit of hyperbole there, but not too much. It was the cool thing to do. But this was deeply worrying to me. Because even though the normative gesture, the thrust of it was to try and emphasize the positive nature of U.S. relations with Muslims, at some level, it was still replicating and reproducing this idea that there was something about Muslims that means they have to be handled differently. They have to have their own program funding lines. We have to appoint officials to their religion, but not any other religion. To my mind, if you're trying to normalize relations with a particular community after a period of time where they have felt put out, scrutinized, alienated, you would do so best by treating them the way you treat everyone else, which means we should have started to treat the Senegalese as Senegalese, the Indonesians as Indonesians, et cetera, et cetera. But no, we're still kind of, we've got this fixed thing about their Muslimness being the most relevant dimension of them. So what I'm saying is that we've reached a situation in which Muslimness has become a manufactured construct, to some extent, of the government gaze, but also from within Muslim communities, and this will be a story that's familiar to many of you, of course. As Muslims began to come into public life more prominently in this country from the 1980s, it was done so via organizations that had ideologically a commitment to the idea that there should be a distinctly Muslim socio-political identity. Groups that were either directly or through legacy connections tied to groups in South Asia and the Middle East that wanted to articulate a very particular politicized Muslim identity, and that claimed to speak on behalf of many Muslims in this country that didn't necessarily share their ideological commitments, but they were the ones who knew how to organize, to get stuff done, and so they played a role in projecting to government a certain Muslimness for their own, I would argue, interests. So we have this weird thing going on where the sort of label, the designation Muslim, has apparently become the appropriate reference point and the thing that we're supposed to focus on in order to understand what's going on. And so part of what I'm wondering about is, in light of the current state of affairs, how do we get out of that? What are the appropriate strategies for either leveraging that in a productive way or dismantling this state of affairs? Finally, and this is the sort of second idea that I've been playing with, and here I'm fairly shamelessly borrowing a trope from the fairly well-known British professor of literature, Paul Gilroy, who wrote a very famous book in the mid-1990s called The Black Atlantic, which is a sort of portrait in literary history of the societies that are, that ring the Atlantic Ocean. The sort of geographic tableau of the global slave trade during the rise of modernity and industrialization, kind of making the point that there is a particular sense of shared identity amongst Afro-Caribbean, African-American, Black British, and Black European, as well as West African identities across this entire space that unifies them through that shared history, and that very racialized history in the way that it's implicated in contemporary society, race relations, and the such. And what I'm wondering is, are we now at a place where it makes sense to think about and to wonder what it might mean to speak about a Muslim Atlantic, in the sense that Muslim communities, both in the UK and the United States, but in Canada, certainly elsewhere in Europe, find themselves in a common predicament today. There's the raw resources of a transatlantic conversation that I don't think was always there. Yes, there's always been a certain amount of transatlantic exchange, obviously certain Americanized currents of theology in the neo-traditionalist vein. People like Hamza Yusuf and such have had a certain currency and influence here. But I mean in the sense that for many years, I don't think that there's Muslim Brits and Muslim Americans had a lot to say to each other because their life circumstances were so different. Right? American Muslims were well integrated. There was no public discourse about them. They were well educated. They had good jobs. Being Muslim wasn't a problem in the United States. Now, it has become so. And I think we're seeing the culmination of that in Trump, and with Brexit here and the sort of ambient xenophobia associated with that. You have this sort of common shared experience of being a community of suspicion and scrutiny. And so what I want to ask is, what would it mean to talk about transatlantic Islam? What would a Muslim Atlantic be about? What sorts of ideas, concepts, tools, and resources would it enact that might be useful in dealing with the current circumstances? One thing that I think it would force us to do, and that I think is very important, would be to recenter the Black American and the Afro-Caribbean British Muslim experience in the discourse. One thing that I think has been very interesting to see in my own country is that, in some regards, the single biggest wedge issue within American Islam has not been, as it has been here, sectarian in the sense of, Deobandi versus Barelvi, or Sufi, Salafi, Ikhwani, whatever, that kind of stuff. It's actually been more immigrant Muslims and black Muslims, right? And this sense of a hegemonic Arabo-centric conception of Islam that led many immigrant Muslims in my country to sort of infantilize black American Muslims as people who don't really know their religion. And there was a huge divide. But I think to the extent that Muslim has become a racialized identity of a sort in the United States over the course of the last 10 years, there's suddenly the possibility for a new kind of dialogue between those two segments of the Muslim population in my country. And one of the silver linings, in my mind, there are very few, of the ascent of Trump has been to see immigrant Muslims reaching out to movements like Black Lives Matter and saying, oh, what you're dealing with is what we're dealing with. You have your own specific, unique set of experiences and history to deal with, but there's enough going on there that we need to talk and maybe do stuff together. Likewise, outreach to advocacy organizations working on behalf of Latino immigrants in my country. So a lot of those kinds of bridge building type activities, which is very important to see. And so I'm wondering, to what extent can that stuff be scaled up? What sorts of ideas and resources might be found by having those conversations and building those bridges across the Atlantic? Because I think there are certain comparative advantages that the British Muslim community has in terms of a longer history of being a community of scrutiny that can be shared with their American co-religionists. And likewise, there's a lot of resources in America, and in some cases, literally resources, that would be useful when it comes to potential collaborations and strategies. So